Gosh, it's good to see this huge crowd. Welcome, everybody. It's been a personal joy of mine over the past 2 years to get to be slightly better acquainted with Kerry McCarthy, who's a wonderful singer and a great friend, and she lives in the neighborhood of the cathedral, in fact, but she's also a world-renowned scholar in Renaissance music, especially English Renaissance music, and she's kindly agreed to do this wonderful three-part class focusing on two composers that we hear frequently at Trinity, William Byrd and Tallis. So thank you, Kerry, and a huge welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all so much for taking the time to sit in on this class. And it's a delight to be talking with the Trinity community about music. And make sure you've got your speakers up so we can hear some music in a little bit. I've got quite a few sound clips to play. And in fact, some people find the sound is better with headphones if you're listening to a lot of music. So you might want to try that if that's comfortable. But for most of the time, I'll be sharing my screen and playing through lots of sound clips and also looking at images. Because I think it's really important to look at visual stuff to see what the Renaissance looked like, not just hear it. Certainly not just hear talking. So as I was saying, it's great to be back in touch with the Trinity community. I have great memories of ever since I moved back to Portland in 2014 of singing in the church there, singing with the choir, singing in various evensongs and concerts. And the musical tradition there is just so amazing. That tradition of choral music, of organ music, it's always just such a privilege to sing there. And I've had a chance to sing a lot of Renaissance music there. I know that you guys love Renaissance music, early music, and especially Tudor music. That's really a key part of the whole Anglican tradition. And it's such a treat to be able to talk with, well, some of the people I've sung with. I recognize a couple names from the choir. So this is really great stuff. So a few practicalities. When I'm teaching, I don't like to fill up slides with lots of words. I don't like slides with lots of text. I tend to use more an immersion approach where you just look and listen and don't worry too much about writing down the details. So I usually just have a little line with whatever the music is, telling you what you're hearing. But there'll be a document with all the details. So you can look at the music. I'll tell you who the performers are, so you can buy the track and support them. And I'll also tell you what the art is and what the visuals are. All right, so 3 weeks to talk about Tudor music. That's not really a very long time because there was so much music going on in the Tudor era. In fact, one thing to remember about the Tudor era was just how long it was, about 120 years. There was a lot of music, a lot of changes in music, and a lot of different generations of musicians doing different things. Just for a little parallel, it's been 120 years from the end of the Victorian era until now. Almost to the day, in fact. I looked up when Queen Victoria died. 120 years from the end of the Victorian era until now. And an unimaginable amount of change has gone on in music and culture and other things. So that's quite a long chunk of time. And clearly 3 weeks, 3 sessions isn't going to be enough to cover all of it. But I'll try to hit some of the highlights. And of course, the main subject for especially our last 2 classes will be these 2 wonderful composers, Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. In fact, class number 2 will be all about Tallis because he was a whole generation older. And then class number 3 is going to be all about Byrd. What I'd like to do in this first class, this first evening, is something a little bit different. I want to start by just getting us into the Tudor musical world a little bit, just enculturating us a little bit. And tonight, especially, I'm going to be focusing on the whole musical world in the early Tudor years. So the Tudor period started in 1485. I will not be quizzing you on these dates, so no need to write them down. Started in 1485 with the end of the Wars of the Roses, the sort of real-life Game of Thrones, all very crazy. And that finally settled down, and you had the Tudor dynasty in place. So 1485. And the era ended in 1603 when Queen Elizabeth I died. So you've got about 4 or 5 generations worth of people, all with their own musicians, all with their own cultural developments. And we're going to be going basically chronologically through the next 3 weeks. We're going to start around 1500, start around the beginning of the century, and end around 1600, end around the end of the century. So what I want to start with is something that we don't know about Tallis or Byrd. We really don't know where they got their musical training, especially with Tallis. We have no idea where he was a choir boy. We know almost nothing about his family. We don't have the kind of biographical goodies that we have for later composers. 19th and 20th century composers, we can celebrate their birthdays. We have all kinds of letters from their families telling us all kinds of stuff. We have composers who kept journals, for example. A wonderful example is Mendelssohn, who traveled all over, and he went to London, and we have these wonderful journals of his where he's in London and it's raining and he's fell out of the carriage and sprained his ankle, and they serve all this bizarre stuff at breakfast that he doesn't like to eat, and the English people, and we don't have that kind of sort of first-person detail for a lot of these 16th century people. In fact, with Tallis and Byrd, we don't even know when their birthdays were. We can't even celebrate their birthdays because we don't know what day they were born. In fact, the only Tudor composer whose birthday we know was a fellow earlier in the era named Robert Fairfax, who was from a rather aristocratic family, and they were interested, well, the aristocrats were interested in two sorts of things: in genealogy, because they wanted their pedigree, and also astrology, that they wanted to cast horoscopes for their children and see what sort of fortunes they'd have. So, Fairfax, we know, was born on April 23rd, 1464 at 10 p.m. at night. But for people like Tallis and Byrd, we don't have that kind of information. And I think the best way to really get into their early lives, to get into their backgrounds, is to learn a little bit about what it was like to be a young musician back then, what it was like to be a choir boy, what it was like to learn the organ, what it was like to learn how to sing. And so this first session is basically just going to be, as I said, enculturating us a little bit, hearing the sounds, learning the lessons. Now, finally, before I start playing music, some of you might be wondering where I'm sitting right now. This background I'm using is a place that Tallis and Byrd both would have known. This, in fact, some of you might even recognize it if you've been tourists in or near London. This is one of the courtyards at Hampton Court Palace. And just sort of up the river, a sort of nice day trip from London. And you'll notice this isn't one of the grand sort of inner courtyards, these big ceremonial areas. It isn't inside the chapel, because I would not be allowed to sit inside the chapel and lecture for an hour and a half. This is one of the outer courtyards called Carpenter's Court. And this is the kind of area where the sort of mid-range type servants would have spent a lot of time. And that's really what the musicians were in the royal court. They were these sort of mid-range servants with this very specialized job that they did. They certainly wouldn't have been in the grand royal apartments. Henry VIII does not want you in there, maybe especially if you're a member of his choir. But this is an area that literally Thomas Tallis and William Byrd would have wanted. You can see I can actually go out into this area. Walk around the virtual environment. You see the nice little barrels over there. You can put your cup of tea down if you'd like. You can put your glass of wine. You can stand there and talk a little bit. So this is going to be my background for these talks, because I think it's quite evocative somehow, sitting in a place where Tallis and Byrd also would have sat in the breaks between their many services. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen with you. And we'll start to look at some stuff and listen to some stuff. So we tend to think of Byrd and Tallis mostly as church composers. We tend to think of them as mostly doing church music. And that's what I'm going to be concentrating on for the most part in these 3 weeks, partly because these are classes for a church. I see on the website that this is supposed to be spiritual enrichment. Of course, I think all kinds of music can be spiritually enriching. But because this is a church community, and because there is so much amazing church music by these two people, I'm going to concentrate mostly on that. But just to get a little something different in our ears, there was also a lot of party music, a lot of not just secular music, but party music in the 16th century. And this little image here, I think, goes very well with it. This is a table from the Elizabethan era, it's from the 1560s. And one side of it is a little bit better in focus than the other. You can see it's kind of tilted. But this long table here is quite literally a party table. It's a table to have a good time at. You know, it's designed for people to sit around, and you can see there are card games depicted on it. There are musical instruments. There's sheet music. There are fun little beasts and heraldic figures and stuff. Basically, just about anything you might want to do for fun in the 16th century is depicted on this table. And if you look at the instruments here, you can see there's a stringed instrument. There are these various wind instruments. There's some printed music. And all of these instruments you can hear in a piece like this, which is just an example of Byrd not being a serious church composer, but really just writing a piece of party music. So all those instruments, you can hear them right there. And it's a fun piece. If you listen carefully, you can hear he's actually borrowing the chord changes from Greensleeves, which is one reason why it's so catchy. all of this fun stuff. Now, not all secular music was quite so rambunctious. There's also much more mellow, sort of courtly stuff. Here's an example of a piece by Tallis, and the visual image I've chosen for this is just an example of a stringed instrument from around 1600 by an instrument builder named John Rose, who was one of the most famous and most skillful Elizabethan instrument builders. And I know some of you actually play instruments like this. You play the viola da gamba, you play viols. You can see the instrument here on the left is kind of the ancestor of the modern cello. Same dimensions. Some things are different. First of all, you can see it has 6 strings. So there's more going on there. You can also see it has frets, which makes it slightly easier to play. But this design here is so gorgeous because on the one hand, you have these absolutely elegant, simple lines, very, very simple design. But then when you start to look more closely, if you look at the image on the right side, there's all this splendid little detail. In fact, you see the image there is the tree with the serpent around it, which is this very, very ancient symbol, and it's carved right into the instrument. So this is an example of what music for viols, music for this sort of instrument would have sounded like. And this is from a piece by Tallis. I'm mostly playing clips from pieces of music just because time is limited, but this is the end of a 5-part fantasia by him. Let's just listen to it. It's about a minute. So that's Tallis being very elegant. And I think the sound of these instruments, of a group or what they called a consort of viols playing together, is just one of the most luxurious sounds in the world. And one wonderful thing that the English did in the 16th century is they wrote songs for a singer and a group of these instruments. And some of the most fun I've had singing in my life has been singing these so-called consort songs with a group of viols. It's you'll never go back to singing with piano. It's just like being on this waterbed of wonderful, rich sound. So here's this, and of course, another kind of musical instrument that a lot of people played in the English Renaissance was the harpsichord, or what at the time was called the virginals. So this little keyboard instrument you see here on the left. And again, this is a painting from around the 1560s. So the same decade as that beautiful table that I just showed you. And here we have a bunch of children making music. You can see them. In fact, if you look over their heads, the painter has put their ages just to sort of commemorate when they were painted. So the little girl is 10. You can see the number 10 up there. The older boy is 13, the younger boy is 12, and then the tiny little boy is just 7. And he's not quite old enough to be holding a book for singers, and he's certainly not quite old enough to be playing the keyboard. And in any case, they're teaching the girl to play the keyboard because this is going to be a useful social skill for her in whatever court or household she winds up in. The boys are being taught how to sing, in fact, polyphonic music. You can see these are two parts of a larger piece. They're being taught how to sing church music because they might wind up singing in a church. And the little 7-year-old is just there holding his hat, waiting till he's old enough to do this fun stuff like his siblings. So here you got all these little red-haired Elizabethan kids. And we don't know what the girl is playing. In fact, the painter clearly wasn't that familiar with keyboard playing, because especially what she's doing with her left hand, I don't quite see the logic of that. But here's an example of music that would have been played on the harpsichord, on the virginals during this time. And this is a famous little piece by Byrd. In fact, I'm guessing some of you might have played it. This is one of the very few pieces by Byrd that is calm enough for me to play. It's not full of 16th notes. So here we go. And so on. And it's really a lovely piece. And it's sort of, this particular piece by Byrd has kind of worked its way into the English collective consciousness. In fact, if the RSCM keyboard program, this is still one of the examination pieces. You learn how to play this when you're a young musician about the age of this little girl. Luckily, you don't have to dress up in this sort of outrageous outfit with the corset and everything, but it's a very simple piece. And yeah, if you like Renaissance keyboard music, that is a good place to start. Okay, so there are just a few examples of what the instrumental music would have sounded like, the secular music. But as I said, most of what I want to talk about these next few weeks is singing, partly because Trinity has such an amazing tradition of singing, which so many of you are involved with, but also because there was just so much of it going on during the Tudor era. So many churches with amazing music programs. If you look back at the documents from 16th century England, especially before the Reformation, especially before things were simplified and sort of popularized a bit, you have huge, huge, huge numbers of professional musicians who are singing in churches, and not just in the big cathedrals, but also even in the parish churches. Any parish that had a little bit of extra money, was spending at least some of it on having really good professional singers. In fact, I've calculated that at what seems to have been the sort of high water mark of professional singing in England, professional church music, around 1530, about 1 out of every 40 people in England who was literate was employed as some sort of church musician. Now, of course, we have to remember that's 1 out of 40 people who were literate, and the literacy rate was 10% at most, and less than that among women. So we're not talking a huge amount of the population, but of people who were literate, who could read and write and use that in their work, quite a large chunk of them were being employed as some kind of church musician. So what I want to talk about now is that sort of world that they were in, what they saw, what they sang, what it would have been like during these early years when Thomas Tallis was a young boy, maybe like one of these boys here. I don't know if he was redheaded, unless we dig him up someday from his for the churchyard in Greenwich where he is and do a little DNA test on the hair. But I just want to start by talking about singing and how people learned how to sing. So my first image here, this is a stained glass window. And this is from one of the few churches in England that has all of its pre-Reformation stained glass completely intact. This is Great Malvern Priory, kind of out in the sticks. Obviously, nobody was fanatical enough to destroy all of these windows with images of the Virgin Mary and so forth. So it's all still intact. And there's this beautiful set of windows that are essentially the life story of the Virgin Mary, from her birth up until her being taken up into heaven. And this one here that we're looking at is, I think, the most evocative, my favorite, partly because it's not even a window. You see, the imagery is just so expansive and so beautiful. It doesn't even fit in one window. They had to use 3. So you have this beautiful blue glass. It's cobalt blue, which is the sort of firmament all around her. And then you have these rays of light, this sort of radiation coming off of her. There she is going up into heaven. Above her head, you have the Holy Spirit. And then you have the rest of the Trinity here. You have the Father and the Son. I love these figures because, sometimes in art, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you see God the Father as this sort of fellow with a beard, and then you have Christ sort of with the long hair. But here, these images of God are really, they're just non-representational. They're these sort of mysterious gray, they almost remind me of Chagall stained glass, sort of almost going beyond what you can represent and almost being abstract. And I love this depiction of God, and then of course you have the dove up top completing the Trinity. So here's this window, and this is the kind of image that a singer would have looked at as they sang in the early 16th century. Again, even the poorest churches, if they could afford one nice stained glass window, one beautiful image like this, they would spend that money, they'd put it in a prominent place, very often in the Lady Chapel, which is where a lot of the singers would have done a lot of their work. And this would have been a sort of visual centerpiece. And this is the kind of thing that might have been heard just under it.
Quod chorus patum venerandus olim, Spiritus Sanctus et Spirit repletus, in Dei factum genitris et constat,
So that is Gregorian chant. And in fact, this particular chant is from a book that was published for use in England in 1519. So just as Tallis would have been a young chorister, just as he would have been learning how to sing various kinds of church music, is when this particular book was published, and we'll see the book in the next slide, or we'll see a clip from it. But something that I think is worth remembering is before the Reformation, 95% of the singing that went on in church was either plain chant, Gregorian chant, like what we just heard, or fairly simple improvisation on it, direct improvisation on it. These huge fancy pieces of church music that we sing as anthems, that we sing on special occasions, those were really like the ornament on the tree. You didn't sing that much polyphony. But on the other hand, you sang hours and hours and hours of chant. That was the first thing that they taught choir boys how to sing. They memorized hours and hours of it. They got extremely good at it. And it was this sort of base layer. If you think of the polyphony as the ornament on top, there's this very, very large tree, which is all this chant. And before Tallis ever composed a note of this fancy music that we know him for, he would have sung thousands of hours of what we just heard. So now this is what it looks like in the printed book. So there's a lot of information here on this page. First of all, there's a wall of text. You're probably wondering about the wall of text. And what's going on here is something that goes on in a lot of modern churches. This particular piece of music happens to be a hymn. You have hymns in Gregorian chant, just like you have hymns in more recent church music. And one characteristic of a hymn, of course, is that it has a fairly short, bite-sized melody, but it has a lot of verses, or at least you can sing a lot of verses. You have the possibility of it. And what you've got here is what you get in a lot of hymn books. I find especially English hymn books are particularly difficult about this. You get the tune once, and then you have to fit all the words to the tune that you see one time. In fact, some hymnals I've seen in England when I've visited churches there, it's even worse because they expect everyone just to know the tune. They say, well, you sang this at school, you grew up singing this. And so we just expect you to know this, and all that's in the hymnal is the words. Here you get the tune once, and then this wall of text that you see under it is going to give you the rest of the verses. So now that we have the music in front of us, now that we have this book in front of us, which almost certainly Thomas Tallis himself would have sung from as a young chorister, let's listen to the music again and follow along.
Quod chorus patum venerandus olim, Spiritus Sanctus esit repletus, in Dei factum genitris constat, esse Maria.
And that's the exact experience that your average young choir boy would have had when they started singing. They would have been listening to other people sing, following along with the music, maybe getting a little bit confused at times. I see the printer here has done a very dirty trick. They've changed the clef in the middle of a phrase, you see. They realize, well, the melody is about to get a little bit higher. So on the top line before the word olim, it's all of a sudden you just change the clef. But what I'd like to do is just listen to it one more time and then try a little experiment. So here is our verse again.
Quod chorus patum venerandus olim, Spiritus Sanctus esit repletus, in Dei factum genitris constat, esse Maria.
Now this is where I'm going to find out if everyone has really muted themselves, because I'm going to sing a phrase and then I'd like you, if you'd like, to sing it back along with me. So the first time, if you could just listen, and then the second time, sing it along with me. Quod chorus fatum. Let's try that much. Quod chorus fatum. Now try. Quod chorus fatum. Venerandus olim. Try. Venerandus olim. Let's try the whole, I'll sing the whole first phrase and then repeat it after me. Quod chorus fatum venerandus olim. Try that. Quod chorus fatum venerandus olim. Great. Now that's how choristers would have started learning chant, by rote repetition. And the great thing about rote repetition is you don't have to worry at first about all the bizarre things going on in the notation. You don't have to worry about the fact that, well, it doesn't say vatum, it says vatu. There's that little line over the U, which is an abbreviation because there wasn't room for the M. You just hear me singing vatum with an M and you sing it back. You don't worry about the weird clef change at the end of that phrase because, again, you're just repeating what you hear. And it's amazing, especially with young children. You know, before, up to the age of 11 or 12, kids are just sponges. You know, if you've ever heard, just how much kids are able to memorize. And choristers, you know, starting at the age of 7 or 8, they would have been singing hours and hours of chant like this, even before they got to use the books. There were some rules in some places that the youngest children did not get to use the books because, of course, they'd just tear them, spit on them, drop them, you know, not get much use out of them. But you start not even looking, but just listening and repeating. So this little piece of chant we'll come back to next week because, in fact, it is relevant to Tallis, not just because I think he might have sung it, but because he composed a piece of music based on it. So just keep that in your ears. And what I want to go on to now is something quite different looking. What do you think this is? This is an unusual musical source, an unusual document, because it's not on a piece of paper, it's not on a piece of parchment even. This is a rock. It looks like a rock, you're not mistaken. It's a piece of slate. And slate is sort of hard, scratchable rock that could be used as a reusable writing surface. This is something that young scholars, young choristers used to learn how to write musical notation, learn how to compose music. The great thing about a slate is it's reusable. Unlike paper, which was very expensive, once you've used that, it's gone. Throw it out, burn it, you can't reuse it. Parchment, you can probably scrape once or twice and reuse, but parchment was extremely expensive. You don't use that to teach children. But a slate, great thing about a slate like this is you write your music on it, you practice, and then it buffs out and clears off, and then you make more lines and do it again. And this particular slate is actually from Scotland, and it's from around the year 1500. So from right around the time of that stained glass window that we saw, right around the time of the chant book that we just sang from. And this was found in a sewer near a school. And in fact, if you talk to archaeologists from the Renaissance, or really archaeologists from any period, one of the best places to find things, exciting little artifacts, is in sewers and in outhouses. Because no matter how much you like something, no matter how valuable or interesting it is, if it goes down the outhouse, you're not going in after it. That thing is history. You're going to go to the teacher and ask for a new slate and probably get in serious trouble. But the wonderful thing is, so that this thing got dropped down into the sewer in the exact state that it was in when this kid was taking their class. It seems to have had a piece broken off it when it hit the bottom. But you can see the staff lines, just like you have staff lines in modern notation. Some of the note shapes are a little bit different. You see you have square notes like we had in the chant. You also have triangular notes, little lozenge-shaped notes. But this is a slate that a child would have used to learn how to write music. Just like in classrooms, people used slates very often with chalk. That's the ancestor of the modern chalkboard, or more recently, the whiteboard you have in classrooms. Students also had their own personal little slates. And this one here is one that miraculously got preserved as it was being used in the classroom. The kid went for a bathroom break. Whoops. Well, and 500 years later, it got dug out. Now, one more image I want to look at before we take a little break so I can take some questions. This also has to do with teaching children. This image here is a really fun project that I've been involved with. This image is a picture I took inside Windsor Castle. Maybe some of you have been to Windsor Castle as tourists. This big, huge, beautiful sort of complex of buildings. There's a church in there. There's this tower. The royal family still spends time there. But this is in one of the old, really old section of the buildings. And this is the room where the choir boys used to have their classes. This was the classroom for the choir. And when they were renovating it in the 1960s, they were ripping all this Victorian stuff off the walls and cleaning up all this dirt. And what they found underneath it was this mural that you're looking at with musical notation. And again, the notation is from just around the year 1500, just this time period that we're looking at now. And you can see that the room where the choir boys had their music lessons actually had wall paintings with music. In fact, you can see some evidence that there are different layers, that there was music painted on, and then they whitewashed over it and they painted more. You can see different kinds of notation. Some of it looks pretty simple, kind of like Gregorian chant, like plain chant. Some of it's a little bit more complicated. But the kids, they literally would have been singing off these images on the walls. And what better sort of pedagogical device than to have something the kids could actually stand there and look at together? Now, the frustrating thing about this, so I went there and actually worked on the paintings and tried to figure out what was going on. It was amazing to actually be led into this area of Windsor Castle, where they do not allow tourists into this room. In fact, this is a meeting room. You can tell from the very expensive looking brass light fixtures and the sort of minty green walls. For all I know, the Queen has meetings here. I actually had to get a security clearance to go and work in this place, but there's not quite enough of the music left to know what it actually is, to know what pieces we're looking at, to know who the composers were. I would love to figure out who the composers were, but they scraped off just too much before they realized what they were dealing with. And even you can see now there are these panels that are normally closed. They keep them closed when it's used as a meeting room, because every hour that this stuff is exposed to light, more of it fades, more of it crumbles. It was very generous of them even to open it for me and let me work on it. But this, just like this, the little slate that I showed you, the little chalkboard that I showed you in the last slide, is a very precious little reminder, because it's quite rare to see something like this, of what children would have looked at when they were learning how to read this music. The sort of hands-on techniques that were used to show kids how music worked, to show kids how to sing, to show kids how the notation functioned. And, you know, we don't know if Tallis was at Windsor Castle as a young boy. He certainly wound up working for the court later on. But again, this is an image that he, conceivably might have looked at, might have sung from himself. Okay, so we're almost halfway through the class now, and what I'd like to do is stop the screen share for a moment. And I see I've got some questions in the chat box. So somebody's asking, I don't hear vibrato. Did Tudor music not use vibrato as a technique? That's a very good question, and it's kind of a frustrating thing to think about, because we know very little about what vocal production was like in the 16th century. We have some circumstantial evidence. We know that a lot of people in church choirs had very, very long careers. especially in the Chapel Royal, for example, where Byrd sang for a lot of his life, and Tallis as well. That was a tenured job. You were there for life, and there were people singing who were in their 70s and sometimes even into their 80s. And as the voice gets older, there's definitely some wobble that comes in. We hear a lot from music theorists and people writing about music. They talk about singing cleanly and clearly. Now, the word clean, that can mean just about anything. That can mean singing the right notes, which is obviously an important thing. A lot of people, when they talked about clean singing, seemed to be talking about tuning. Tuning was something, obviously, with keyboard instruments and other instruments, something people were really, really concerned with in the 16th century. There was this sort of struggle to get tuning systems that worked as well as possible. And a lot of what you hear about clean singing, I think was tuning related. Now, in the 16th century, you start to get some stops in organs in other countries that you get the sort of tremulant effect. You have sort of vibrato type things. There are only a couple English organs that survive at all from the Tudor era that can even be reconstructed. There are no stops like that. There's no sort of, there's no sort of tremulant vibrato effect. It's not something that people loved enough for organ builders to go out of the way and imitate. So the short answer is, and that was a very long answer, the short answer is I don't know. A lot of this music was so complicated, especially some of the stuff we're going to hear in the second half of class. If you have 6 voices, 6 parts singing in a big chorus, and everyone's using vibrato, you're not going to hear anything clearly. It's just going to be a mess. I mean, think the opera chorus singing Verdi, with elephants and huge costumes, but you can't do Tallis like that. With Verdi, it's extremely effective, but when you have this level of counterpoint, this amount of stuff going on, there has to be a certain clarity. All right, so Byrd must have been writing through the Reformation. Sasha Stanton asks, did his music also change? Absolutely. In fact, both next week and the week afterwards, in some ways, the main subject is going to be change, is going to be this sort of mutability, this one individual composer living through a very long life with all kinds of stuff going on, and especially with Tallis. You listen to his earliest works and his latest works, and you can hardly believe that they're by the same guy. He just lived through so much change. He was almost 3 or 4 different composers. And with Byrd, there's maybe a little bit more continuity, partly because Byrd just did whatever he wanted. He had a strong enough ego, that kind of persisted. But yeah, there's going to be so much change that in some ways it's almost hard to keep track of. This class this week is our one brief moment of stability, so everybody can enjoy that, looking at our beautiful stained glass. All right. Yes, and Celia said the middens heap. Yes, the happy place for archaeologists. So whatever goes down there is going to stay down there until somebody goes out and does a dig in the year 2020. I think that's everything that I see now in the chat box. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again and go back to some more images and some more music. All right, so when I left, we were here in the choir boys' classroom in Windsor Castle, looking at these wonderful kind of enigmatic wall paintings that the children would have used to learn how to sing, learn how to read the notation. Now, another place where you see this kind of notation, the next thing I'm going to show you is almost exactly contemporary with these wall paintings. And if you walk out of Windsor Castle, you walk out the gates, and you go down to the River Thames. You're quite a ways upstream from London, but it's still the same river as that big muddy thing that that runs past the Tower of London. Walk across the bridge, and you get to Eaton College, very, very famous place for music in the early Renaissance. And you see a very nice manuscript that they still have in their library that looks like this. And some of you will probably recognize this. This is the Eaton Choirbook. It's one of the many, many pages from the Eaton Choirbook. And you can see it's a full-scale illuminated manuscript. It has gold leaf. Not all the pages have gold leaf, but this beautiful illuminated letter, this beautiful musical notation. You can see the some of the words are in red. And what that meant was, by the way, was the words that were in red were sung by soloists, by just little groups of soloists, and then the words that are in the brown ink, the normal ink, were sung by the whole choir. So it's basically a way of saying soli and tutti, but it's so much more elegant to do it with that red ink. And I wish I knew the chemical composition of this red ink, because you go there and you look at the book. I've been lucky enough to actually look at the Eaton Choirbook in person. And that red looks like it was written yesterday. It's like the most amazing Pantone paint chip you'll ever see, that red. And the gold leaf, it hasn't aged in 500 years. A beautiful manuscript. And another thing about this manuscript that it's kind of, doesn't really sink in until you've seen it in person, is how big it is. This isn't a little musical part book that someone can hold and sing out of. This, I don't think that one person could even carry this. It's designed to be stood on this lectern, stood on this stand. The whole community gathers around it and makes their music. So this, as you can see, is the same notation as these murals here. But now it's in this absolutely grand musical manuscript that a whole community, grown-up singers, and also the boys at the school would have been singing from. So I'd like to play you some music from the Eaton Choirbook. Here is the chapel of Eaton College. And I don't know, again, if maybe some of you have been there as tourists, but here is a nice indoor and outdoor image. You can see it's obviously not January in England here. Everything looks very nice and springy. But you can see the dimensions of the chapel. It's really a quite massive place. It's kind of comparable to a lot of the chapels in Oxford and Cambridge, and those colleges there that were designed with this high vaulting, these high windows, and designed just to be these jewel boxes that made the music sound as good as possible. And if you look at the inside picture here on the left, pretty much every single detail that I'm looking at has to do with music in some ways. You've got these high ceilings for the ideal acoustics. You've got the organ loft with the organ. This organ is not 16th century. The 16th century organs there would have been smaller, more modest. This is a bit more of a romantic setup here, but you've got this organ. As at Trinity, it's the most impressive thing you see. You walk in and you see this organ and you realize this is a place where they care about music. Then below the organ loft, you have these rows of chairs. And the chairs here are what are called choir stalls. And of course, the word stall nowadays, we think of, animals, sort of horses and things going in there. But all that a stall really means is your place, your spot, the sort of enclosed area where you can stand, where you can sit. And these rows of choir stalls are for the singers. Even at Trinity, for example, you don't have quite as lavish an arrangement of choir stalls, but you have these nice chairs and these spots where various members of the hierarchy at the church can sit during the services. And here you actually have 3 rows. This is the standard setup, 3 rows on each side, the setup that you had in Renaissance English churches. The back row would have been the clergy. And in English cathedrals, you can still see that at least officially, these back rows are often reserved for the clergy. The second row is the professional singers, who are not clergy. They're professional musicians who are grown-ups who are hired to sing. And then the front row, out in front, where everyone can keep an eye on them and make sure they're not dropping their things and breaking them, are the boys in the sort of lowest rank. And then, of course, you see the candles there on top of the choir stalls. There wouldn't have been, of course, any electric light in the 16th century, and a lot of these services would have gone on at night. Especially in England, this time of year, the sun sets at 3:30 or 4, and that's all, and it's going to get dark. So these chapels went through a lot of candles. You see beeswax is one of the huge expenses. And those candles are set up so everybody in the choir can see just well enough to sing their music. So everything in this image that you see, literally every visual detail of the inside of this building, is designed to make the music even more beautiful and to make it work even more efficiently. So here's a little bit of music from the Eaton Choirbook that would have been sung inside this chapel around 1500. So many of the pieces in this manuscript are 15 minutes long. They're really monumental pieces of music for a monumental building. I can't play the whole thing because that would take us almost to the end of class, so I will just play the first minute or so. And I especially like this recording because it actually has boys singing the top part instead of a bunch of cynical, professional sopranos my age. You've actually got boys singing as they would have been singing the soprano part in 1500. And I like to think they would have sounded something like this. And I think that might partially answer the question about vibrato that somebody asked earlier. This is a piece of 8-part music. So the choir is singing in 8 parts, and you've got this sort of high soprano part on top. Unless you sing this fairly clearly, all the details are just going to get lost. It's like trying to look at a page without your glasses. It just goes all very fuzzy. So extremely complex stuff, very monumental, as this building is monumental, and also a lot of detail. If you look at the stained glass windows on the outside image on the right, you've got all these little sections and all these little subsections and all these little bits of tracery and all these little ornaments. And then above them, you have the statues, you have the grotesques, you have these little things on top of the towers, which I'm not an architect, so I don't know the name of. But all the sort of idea of monumentality plus beautiful detail is what you get in these big pieces. And of course, to be a choir boy, to be a child, and to be able to be part of something like this, must have been something really thrilling. And I think about a place like Eton College, where this music was composed, and the amount of singing that the children in the choir would have done, especially before the Reformation, when they had 7 services every single day. Some of the 7 services would have been compressed into fewer. You would have done 2 at once. Some of them, the boys didn't actually sing, the clergy just sang. But still, these kids were in chapel for hours every single day. And they were singing this stuff that, is physically quite taxing. Especially if you sung the soprano parts of a lot of this early Renaissance music, the lines tend to be very, very long. Sometimes you start to get lots of ornamentation. Sometimes it sits up high for a long time. And this takes a lot of physical effort. And in some ways, when I think about the choristers who sang this stuff, they were almost like athletes in a way. They were like child athletes. They were like the kids who go out and do gymnastics for hours every single day, the kids who run competitively. You sort of commit yourself physically to that. It's tiring. You're away from home for a lot of the year. You have to train. You have to do things that aren't always fun. But you're performing at this extremely high level, and doing this stuff that what other 10-year-old would get to perform in front of the king when the king came to visit, and and almost compete at this very high level. So in fact, a detail that I'd like to play is in this next slide. And this is what happens next in this piece of music from the Eaton Choirbook. So we just heard this huge opening section. There's this tutti section with the whole choir sort of showing off in 8 parts. And we're going to hear what happens next. So here's just that big final chord that we just heard, and then it'll continue. So when we looked at the manuscript with the music, I was talking about the text and how some of it was in the brown ink and some of it was in the red ink. And the red ink showed where the soloists would sing. Now this was one of those little solo sections. In fact, you have 2 singers singing solo in this ethereal little duet. And this would have been a really big responsibility for a kid. You know, it's easy enough just to sing in a big chorus, but then the choir director tells you, 9 years old, okay, you sing this section now. You're all on your own. It's this beautiful high part. You get to read it out of the book. You'd better not make a mistake because the whole service is going to fall apart. You have to have very good lungs. You have to have good breath control. You have to know how to read these little little ornaments at the end. And it's quite a thrilling thing for a kid to be able to participate, you know, at a level like this. And that's what's wonderful about this music is the top parts, the sort of parts that we just heard for the boys to sing, they're not any easier than the parts for the grown-up paid professionals. You know, the kids were held to just as high a standard. And that's really true, you know, even nowadays in the English cathedrals, which is why I think English singers are such spectacularly good sight readers. If any of you have, like me, have had the opportunity to sing in groups with English professional singers, they'll just blow you out of the water. They sight read perfectly. They almost never make mistakes, you know. And I think so much of it is that tradition of really serious childhood training and giving kids that kind of responsibility, you know, to stand in a place like that big chapel and sing this really, really complex music. So this image here that we looked at while the boys sang their solo section, this is a detail from the inside of Eton College Chapel, where this manuscript came from. And you can see at the bottom that woodwork there, that fine woodwork, those are a few of the choir stalls, the seats where the singers would sit and then of course stand when they had to sing. And you can see they're carved out of wood. Each one is just big enough for a person, well, a 16th century sized person. Perhaps they need to make them a little bit wider nowadays, but each one's the size of a person. And then up above, you see you have this beautiful art on the wall. You have this painting that's so elaborate it almost looks like carved stone. It's this sort of quasi three-dimensional trompe-l'oeil, to use the French term, painting. And you can see this is actually Saint Catherine. She's holding her book. She was reading her book there. Of course, this being an educational establishment, you want to show a good example of people reading books. And you can see there's the sword that she has. And if you look under her feet, there is the wheel, the broken wheel, which is part of her iconography. So there's St. Catherine presiding over the choir stalls. And then what you see to the left of her, that's also a wall painting. Again, this is decorative art from basically the same generation as this music. It would have been painted at the same time as the music was composed. And what that is instead of a painted sculpture, it's a painted tapestry. Now, putting tapestries on walls was very popular in the Renaissance. If you had money, if you wanted your place to look nice, you'd hang luxury textiles on the walls. Why do you think they painted this tapestry instead of just tapestrying the church?
Absorb the sound.
Absolutely. They did not want to mess with this amazing acoustic. They didn't want to do anything that would possibly make this choral singing even a little bit less glorious. So instead of tapestrying the wall, they did something that was actually much more labor intensive and more expensive. And they had an artist come in and create these painted tapestries on the stone that would leave the acoustic intact. Now, not all people in the English Renaissance were that smart. Henry VIII, for example, in his court chapels, he just wanted all the luxury he could get, and he had them hang the place with wool and with velvet and with silk, and it probably sounded like an absolute toilet in there, But this particular church, where they really were focused on music and focused on music education, they did whatever it took to make that place sound as good as possible. So thus the painted tapestry. Now here is something, we've been looking at some very, very grand images, some very elite images. Here is something a little different. You're probably wondering, what on earth are we looking at here? What's this woven mat? And this is something that you would have seen in a lot of churches, even the very simple parish churches. When I go through and I look at the documents, the records of churches where people sang in the English Renaissance, you see a lot of little stuff that the singers used. Anyone who's been in the choir room at Trinity, you know that having a functioning choir, you need a lot of stuff. You know, you don't just need the sheet music. You need the chairs, you need the coffee mugs. The coffee mugs are very, very important. And in fact, choirs in the 16th century had lots of drinking vessels. They usually drank things slightly more potent than coffee out of them, but they had their drinking vessels and they had money to keep them full. And one thing that a lot of singers used were mats, were rush or wicker mats. In fact, the church where Tallis sang as a young man in London, every once in a while, they would pay somebody to make 5 or 6 round mats for the singers to stand on while they sang. And it was a busy place, and they did a lot of singing because every few years the mats would wear out and they had to get more. And it's also nice, we know that they pretty much always had 5 or 6 people singing the services because that's the number of mats. And then for the choir boys, the little boys who joined in the services sometimes, they did not get their own round mats. The mats for the grown-ups were round. The boys just had one long strip of matting that they stood on. Because if you give little round mats to boys, they'll use them as frisbees and it'll be a disaster. I know exactly what would happen. But you have this matting, and it's a very practical thing when you think about English churches, and especially how cold it gets, how damp it gets. And before the Reformation, how long some of these services were. If you sing a big mass, if you sing matins, especially if you sing the services during Holy Week and Easter, you can be standing there for 3-4 hours. In some ways, the length of those services, it's really closer to what you get in Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox churches nowadays, that there's more stuff. So to keep the singers comfortable and to keep their feet from freezing, because if you stood in an unheated church and tried to sing, your feet get cold, they had these mats to stand on. And I think this kind of humble choir furnishing, this tells us really just as much as these grand wall paintings in some place like Eaton College Chapel. It shows us the kind of stuff that singers used in their daily lives. You know, again, when in Greenwich, in London, they excavated the chapel there when they were digging up the old palace. And they found a bunch of old stuff. Unfortunately, they didn't find any slates with music. I don't think there was actually a midden, a toilet in the chapel area to dig down. But they found a little knife that probably one of the musicians had left there, and it got stuck in a crack in the chapel and got excavated 400 years later. Just this little knife with and the handle was carved bone, and it had these little Tudor roses carved on it. It's a beautiful little object. And again, for all I know, that's something that Tallis himself might have owned. But these little sort of relics of the stuff that singers used, it sort of gives us an image of what their life was like on a more day-to-day basis. And just like we have humble objects, like this little matting, this little fragment of matting here that people would have stood on when they sang or when they played, we also have music that was a lot more humble. You know, the stuff that I just played you, this huge 8-part polyphony, again, that was really the top of the tree. That was the most complex stuff. And most of what people would have been singing in church was a lot simpler. A lot of it would have been the chant that we heard, and a lot of it would have been the kind of thing I'm going to play you now. This very, very simple improvised style, where you're basically just starting with a chant melody and creating chords around it. It would have sounded like this. So to make that kind of music, you don't even really need a book. All you need are people who know the simple chant melody and who know what to do to create chords that sound good around it. In fact, basically what these three folks are doing on this recording is, to get into a little music theory, they're just singing mostly parallel first inversion chords. It's a pretty simple setup. Once you start it, you can just pretty much sing the rest of the piece. And this is something that young singers would have been trained to do, because it was an important skill, not just to know how to read fancy music off fancy manuscripts, but how to take something very simple like a little chant, a little verse of chant like we just saw in the chant book an hour or so ago, and be able to improvise this simple stuff. And the great thing about this improvised stuff is it's portable. You don't have to carry a massive choir book manuscript that takes 3 people even to lift. And in fact, we have a wonderful account of an Englishman who, in the 15th century, went all the way to Jerusalem. This would be a whole nother lecture, but he went on this pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and he was a musician. He was a precentor, the leader of music at a church. And he kept a sort of journal of his pilgrimage. And one thing he wrote down was what they sang at various places, various holy sites in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. And a lot of the music, a lot of the notes that he took is that they sang this piece or that piece using this technique that we just heard in what was called fa burden, which is equivalent to the French faux bourdon, this sort of 15th century technique. They sang this piece or that piece in fa burden. And the reason why you get so much of that is because clearly you had people on this pilgrimage who liked to sing, who wanted to sing in all these churches in Jerusalem and see what it sounded like and honor the place. You can't bring that much luggage with you on a 15th century pilgrimage. Your luggage allowance is, it's not 50 pounds, 82 three-dimensional inches or whatever. You basically bring what you can carry on your back, if that. And this kind of music is so wonderful because it's very portable. You don't need much in the way of resources. You just need to know your chant, and you need to know some basic techniques. So this is something on a much humbler level. And then I have one more image for you, also on a humbler level. This is what a simple parish church would have looked like in the 16th century. This is a parish church out in the sticks in Norfolk, again, in the east of England. Again, a place that has quite a bit of original stuff left because it wasn't central enough for them to bother going through and burning it all down. And you can see there's the organ here. This is not a 16th century organ, it's slightly later added. But the basic structure of the place is the same as it would have been in the 16th century. You've got the altar there at the east end. And then you've got this screen, what was called the rood screen, R-O-O-D. Not rude as in impolite, but rude as in the cross, because there would have been, see, this was torn down at the Reformation, but there would have been a big crucifix on top of this screen. And the wonderful thing about these screens is sometimes they were also used by the singers on special occasions. In fact, there's a note in the chant books that on Palm Sunday, for example, a few of the boys are supposed to climb up. So even at a church like this, that's got to be, 8 or 9 feet. Climb up onto the top of the screen and sing a special piece of music from there. Or again, on All Saints' Day, in honor of the saints, 4 boys are supposed to climb up to the high place and sing a special piece of music there. Now, we talked about how thrilling it is as a little kid to be able to sing a solo in these important services and be trusted to sing this complicated music. Now, this must have been wonderful for the boys to not just to get to sing solos, but to climb up to high places. In the service for All Saints' Day, it was even better because they were holding lighted candles. So you have heights, that's great. You have open flame, that's great. You have solo singing, that's great. 3 of the most exciting things in the whole world, and you get to do them all. So here's a piece by Tallis, just another little preview of Tallis's music before next week. This is a piece to be sung by 4 boys on All Saints' Day. I heard a voice from heaven, audivi vocem. And again, I like this recording because it's actually sung by children. These are 4 children from a choir in Oxford. And just imagine them up there on top of the screen with their open flames, not setting anything on fire. And so on. And again, I'll have all these pieces of music listed for you so you can go look them up if you want. But I just like to imagine the kids, climbing a ladder, and standing up there and singing this beautiful piece that you only get to sing once a year with your candles. In fact, when you start to look at the information about musical training, about choir boys, about what it was like to be a child in the musical world, there's so much interesting evidence. It really is frustrating that we know so little about Tallis's childhood and about Byrd's childhood. We know a little bit about Byrd's family, at least, and we'll hear more about that on the 3rd session in a couple weeks from now when we talk about Byrd particularly. We know that he was from London. We don't even know where Tallis grew up, but we know that Byrd was from London. Byrd was from a musical family. 2 of his older brothers were choristers. They would have sung in church choirs. In fact, they sang at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which is kind of the top of the heap, for a London family. It's probably the best choir to get your boys into back then. And we know that his sister wound up running an instrument building shop and this very musical family. But we don't really know where Byrd himself was trained. We just have to go back to these little hints, these little rubrics in the book saying, this is where the boys are supposed to sing. These little physical fragments of evidence, like the little piece of slate that a boy learned to write on, these wall paintings that are 90% gone, that show us what the classroom would have looked like, what the kids would have been looking at as they learned how to sing. And even one more source. Now, this isn't a visual image, this is a text. This is a text that I always like to read from when I'm telling people about choristers, about children learning how to sing. And this is from a textbook for choir boys that was basically teaching them Latin. And as you know, when you're learning a language, the best way to learn is by learning little phrases. If anybody has done Duolingo, for example, you get all kinds of crazy stuff about elephants eating pineapples, and it helps if they're funny, but it also helps if the phrases are something that you can use in everyday life, if they're somehow relevant, preferably in a slightly amusing way, to your everyday life. And a lot of these phrases in English Renaissance textbooks for boys in these choir schools, they had to do with music. because you're more likely to want to translate something or want to learn something, learn the verbs, if they have to do with your everyday life. So here, I'm just going to read you, before we go back to the chat box and take a few final questions, I'm just going to read you a few phrases from one of these little phrase books for boys. And then I'll tell you a bit more about it. And I'll read them in English, not in Latin, because we don't have time to do translation exercises. But these are some little sentences that kids would have learned in the time of Tallis's childhood. Continual singing dulleth the voice, and resting refresheth. A song is better judged afar than near. That's interesting, again, about acoustics. Here is an uncouth song. The stalls of the church make a great noise when the seats are let down. The chanter or setter of the choir was absent. It's not a good thing to have happen. And finally, a little sentence for the little boys who are just starting to learn: sing louder. It's often a very useful phrase to use with kids. Sing louder. And in fact, this particular textbook with all of these fun phrases was written by the Latin teacher at Eaton College, where this beautiful musical manuscript was made, where we had a little look inside the chapel, where they cared so much about music that they wouldn't even hang tapestries on the walls. They painted them in so the acoustics wouldn't be spoiled. And another nice thing about these sentences is it shows that even at this sort of elite musical establishment, where they're spending huge amounts of money on musical training, stuff still goes wrong sometimes. You notice that continual singing dulleth the voice. Well, that's true. You sing 7 services a day and you're trashed at the end of it. Here is an uncouth song. I think the song we're looking at in this manuscript is not uncouth, but there was clearly some uncouth music floating around. A song is better judged afar than near. Again, that really just makes me think about acoustics. The stalls of the church make a great noise. I've never actually heard all those benches being let down, but I think in a place like that, it would be deafening. The cantor was absent. It happens now, it happened then. And even the best choristers in all of England were still being told, sing louder. So if your choir director tells you to sing out, you're not the first person, you're not the first person to hear that complaint. All right, so that's all the images I have for today. And unfortunately, that's all the sound clips I have, because we've only got 7 or 8 minutes left. So what I'm going to do now is unshare my screen and come back to you and have a look at the chat box. What is happening in the shadowed area on the 4th line? Let me just look quickly at that. Oh yes, you see that the 4th line down, that the ink is bleeding through the other side of the page. See, that's the disadvantage of having this beautiful permanent ink, is sometimes it's a little bit too strong. In fact, you have some musical manuscripts from the Renaissance where the ink, it's too caustic. It has too much oak gall in it or something, and the little notes have actually started falling out of the page like confetti. You have this little black and white confetti, which of course makes it very hard to read. But there, what you see on that 4th line is just bleed through from the other side. All right, so that's clear. Did they have castrati in England? No. I'm very happy to be able to say no. In the 18th century, when they started having Italian opera come to England, when famously Handel came to England and started doing all these oratorios, and when everything Italian was very fashionable, yes, they had castrati come from Italy. They were very famous. They got paid a lot more than these old cathedral guys who were just singing in falsetto. But there was no native English tradition of castrati. They taught the boys as hard as they could, and when their voices changed, they got new ones. And seems to have been a lot of falsetto singing as well. A lot of adult men singing parts in alto ranges and even in mezzo ranges sometimes. You have some pretty hefty musical establishments where the men are singing the top parts. So there, and even now you have this whole tradition of English countertenors that didn't start with Henry Purcell. That's something that I think went a lot further back. But no castrati. So all the gentlemen in the audience are uncrossing their legs. Only, I'm very happy to say they didn't do that. That was an Italian vice. Let's see, what else? If they burned tallow candles, the smoke would have ruined any tapestries quickly. Yes, Celia, that is absolutely correct. And maybe one of the main reasons they used beeswax in these chapels, in these churches, partly because officially in church services, you're only supposed to use beeswax candles. Tallow candles are all fine for the kitchen and for the bedroom and so forth. But in church, you're supposed to use noble and sort of honorable materials, which would be beeswax. And also because beeswax doesn't have as much residue. Imagine a year's worth of services and tallow candles. Forget about the tapestries. Your choir robes, your cassock and surplice would be toast. They'd be covered with smoke. So they used beeswax, which was hugely expensive. In fact, in some of these churches, believe it or not, they were spending almost as much on beeswax as they were spending on the singers. And they paid the singers pretty well. So it's, when you think about the budget, basically it's like the electricity budget in a modern church. You keep the lights on, keep the place reasonably heated. All of that would have been going toward wax. So you had lots of beehives, lots of beekeepers in the Renaissance in England, keeping all these churches supplied. Let's see, I'm just going to scroll through. Ground cochineal powder, is that how it's pronounced, from insect wings? Would that have been the red? Oh gosh, wow. Sorry, vegans. Insects have been harmed in the making of this. Well, sorry, vegans. Every page of the Eaton Choirbook is basically a sheep, is a lamb. You slit the thing open, you cure the skin, and that is one piece of music. So yes, I'm afraid this is very much not a vegan lecture series, but ground powder from insect wings. I need to learn more about medieval and Renaissance illumination. That's something I'd like to take a class in. And finally, can you talk about tactus? Oh, 3 minutes to go and a very heavy music theory question. Of course, tactus, being the Latin word, literally meaning touch. And that was the technical term used for the beat, the rhythmic unit in Renaissance music. And if you look at these manuscripts that I showed you, there's something very important missing. In fact, I have time just to share my screen one more time, because I'd like to show you this. What does this manuscript not have? It doesn't have bar lines. It does have a time signature. If you look very carefully up in the left-hand corner, after the illuminated letter with the lamb and so forth, you have a C with a slash through it, which, by the way, is the ancestor of the modern cut time signature. It's basically the same symbol. But once you've set that time signature, you don't have bar lines. So what does that mean? First of all, that means you have to count really well. You don't have the crutch of knowing when the bar is going to start. And you have to have a regular beat that's established in everybody's heads, because you can't just see where you are in the manuscript. You can't see the beginning of each bar. Now, the question about tactus, the question about this beat, there are several questions. First of all, how quickly did this music actually go? What sort of tempos did people sing at in the 16th century? We don't really know that much. We know that if it had gone too slow, you can't breathe. It just doesn't work. We have a nice music theorist from near the end of the Tudor era who said the beat, the subdivided beat, equals the heartbeat. So you got a sort of half note equals, 66, 68. Of course, the catch with that is when you're sight reading complex music, your heart rate goes up. you know, and I'm singing something out of the Eaton Choirbook, my heart rate is not 66, you know. Maybe some of my English colleagues with ice in their veins, they can sing this stuff at a heart rate of 66, but so that kind of biological parameter, you know, might not always work. But definitely we know it couldn't have been too slow. And we know a lot of the acoustics that people sang in wouldn't have been that resonant. You know, a lot of the chapels, as I said, were hung with tapestries. A lot of this music would have been sung in private houses where you had carpeting. You know, some of these noble houses and palaces, every single surface was covered with something soft and plushy. That's how you showed you had a lot of money. And the singers who sang there, and also the players who played there, they would have had to take a sort of reasonable tempo if they wanted it to sound good. So yes, tactus, a great can of worms. Some people talk about tactus as quite literally a touch that you use to keep the beat. We don't have people like they did in 17th century France with big sticks pounding on the ground, that dangerous undertaking. But a lot of pictures, a lot of drawings of choirs, they're standing so close together, they can literally touch each other. And sometimes you even see the choir director, the choir master will be in there with the choir, and he'll have his hands on the boys' shoulders. And I don't think he's just giving them a cuddle. I think he's tapping. He's giving them that beat, you know, until you're experienced enough to be able to count in this bar line list notation. You need a little help just to have that physical cue of that beat on your shoulder. Sometimes I've wished for that when I've been singing this stuff. Somebody come up behind me and tell me where the tactus is. Tap, tap. Well, thank you so much for your questions. That's all the time we have for today. But thank you all so much for being here. And I'm so looking forward to next week, getting into Tallis's life, Tallis's music. Oh yes, okay, a couple questions. What is the name of my book? You'll be glad to hear my book about Tallis is called Tallis, and my book about Byrd is called Byrd. Very short title. And they're both with Oxford University Press in the series they have of composer biographies. So in fact, the best way to get them is to go directly to the Oxford University Press website. They have free shipping. And yeah, don't support Amazon. Amazon is evil. Support the publisher.
Good night, everybody. And night,
yeah.
Kerry.
Good night. See you next time. And enjoy Hampton Court.